Hello, welcome back. Welcome for the first time, if it is indeed your first time here, to Safe Space for White Questions. My name is Alex Kasnabish, and I am here with my partner in crime, Ajay Prasram, who I will throw it over to in a second to say hello to all you lovely folks. Um, if you've been here before, you know the deal. We take your questions about racial injustice, social justice more generally, and we do our best to answer them in a open-hearted and as non-judgmental a way as possible. And we're very excited to do this with you today. Let me get out our necessaries out of the way first. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this episode of Safe Space for White Questions is coming to you from unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. And we'd like to acknowledge our collective responsibility as settlers, if indeed you are a settler, to decolonize our lives and presences here. As I said, my name is Alex Kasnabish. I sell my labor for a wage at Mount St. Vincent University, and I'm one of your co-hosts. I'd like to thank our good friends at Fernwood Publishing, of course, for doing all the amazing bottom lining, production, promotion for this series, and also, just before I turn it over to AJ, to make a very exciting announcement. We're going to do a reveal at the end of the episode for you today. We're going to treat you to some awesome cover art, but we have a book coming out based on this series and on your questions and the discussions we've had here. And it's going to be coming out with Fernwood very soon. It's called Frequently Asked White Questions. And we take basically 10 of the most common questions, themes that we've gotten over the course of our series, and we take a shot at answering them in a cohesive, accessible, conversational, dare we say, even entertaining and amusing way sometimes. So that book is going to be coming to you very shortly. I guess it's due for publication in the fall 2022. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for that. We will have much more information. And at the end of this episode, we will treat you to the amazing cover art that's been designed for us. So without any further ado, let me toss it over to AJ to introduce himself before we get going with your questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jai Parasram, faculty member in development studies and history and political science, sometimes too, here at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, unceded Mi'kmaq. Alex pretty much covered everything, so I just want to get right into your delightful questions. So yeah, kick it back to you, Alex.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a couple of great, somewhat long questions to start off this month with. Oh, and I should mention, sorry, this is our last episode, not our last episode ever, don't worry. This is our last episode of the season. Basically, we are going to go on hiatus for the summer, more or less, and come back to you in September. So welcome to our grand season finale, where we do all kinds of exciting stuff, answer your questions, do the book reveal, all that sort of good stuff. So happy to be with you. Let's get right to it. I'm going to read out the question, and while this is a bit long, I feel a bit awkward summarizing it, so I'm just going to read it. So our first question: regarding changing place names that are deemed offensive. While traveling in a Spanish-speaking country, I bought a box of local black tea with Spanish writing on it, naturally. Black is negro in their language, so it was called the negro. I suspect that many negro place names in English Canada originated as the Spanish or Portuguese word for black. Given that they were early mariners and mapmakers, can understand how that word may be offensive if it were taken to mean a slave of African descent. But what if it was never meant that way? What if it meant the cape was dark against the sea, or the rocks or cliffs were black, or the river was very deep or full of dark minerals? Could trying to eliminate a legitimate word from another language offend a whole other group of people who still use the word as it was initially intended? Black people are rightly proud of being and being called black, but is that only in English? Is it possible to take back the word? Like, I want to take back the Canadian flag after it was wrapped around protesters in the recent trucker convoy. And I'm sorry if I offend anyone, but this is supposed to be a safe space. place. Sorry. So great question to kick things off, and very topical. Obviously, lots of conversations about changing place names, lots of offensive place names all across Turtle Island, unfortunately, and beyond, because of the history of colonialism. So let me take a shot at this question. This is a much more, in many ways, much more nuanced question than we usually get around, or we usually talk about in public discourse around this sort of stuff. So a lot of the the obvious stuff, right? That's like directly offensive, and I don't really want to use the terminology right now. There's so many racially offensive terms. There's one that's used to refer to indigenous women, for example. That's come up as a local topic of conversation recently. Those ones are really obvious, and I think they're fairly uncontroversial. Unless you're an actual racist, you're probably not going to defend something that uses a racial slur. Who cares what the context is, But this is a good question. So I think this is more complicated, and to my knowledge, these, at least in the Canadian context, and I can't, while I've done some work, and it's been a while since I've done field work in Mexico, where I was, or traveled in Latin America. I think the example you're using is a good one. It's a complex one. I would say that's something that's, where excavating the history and having like conversations that are public and open around that is super important, and getting, because it's true, right? Like Black Forest cake isn't a derogatory reference to Black people. It's a reference to the Black Forest in Germany, right? So um, not every use of that word is meant to be racially offensive. But there are all kinds of examples, obviously, of terms that are. So, I mean, I'm dancing around this question. I think I'm going to pass this one over to AJ and let him take a crack at it. My take on this is that you're absolutely right. That this is not using, control F on your Word document to find every instance of the use of a particular word. I don't think anybody who's really interested in racial justice is arguing that. Rather, it's about identifying problematic place names and moving them. So and just I'll finish on this. In the context of the neighborhood that I live in Halifax, there are no racially offensive street names in my neighborhood directly, but there are a couple of street names that are named after vicious and brutal white colonial occupiers, explorers who, raped and pillaged their way across the African continent in particular. And in that case, it's like the word itself, it's just somebody's name, right? So it's not offensive in the sense that the name is offensive. What's offensive is who it's honoring and celebrating. So I guess I'd just say, yeah, I agree with your question. It's a really good point. What we're trying to get at is not some sort of like perfect dictionary terminology that allows us to avoid these things, but rather to pay attention to the context and the historical specificity of the example. Great question, though. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I was gathering my thoughts while Alex was answering. It is very thoughtful, and I find it especially important and provocative because I am not very good at languages, but I have a deep appreciation for languages and people who understand multiple languages, in part because they're authentic windows into radically different worldviews. Like the meaning of a word in one language is almost like, like with some exceptions, just totally different, and even if they share a similar etymology, it doesn't necessarily mean that it carries the same political and social and cultural meaning. So I guess my first thing that I would say to this question is that words can only be taken back by members of the community against whom it has been historically leveled. So the abstract notion of wanting to claim a word, that might describe the cliffs in a very beautiful way, as you described. I feel like in the political context of understanding how words are leveled and waged against communities, the question is really like, what are members of that community looking for, asking for? So I think it would be really interesting to, look into how Afro-Brazilians, for example, identify themselves, and whether or not, the terminology is transferable to like the way blackness is in North America, or even in Europe to some extent. I feel like with blackness, and again, talking as a person who is adjacent to African communities, there has been a whole project of transnationalism and transnational Black culture. So there's lots of facets that cross lots of languages, and there's tons and tons written on the subject. Like, for example, in the Black Pacific, Robbie Shilliam goes to great and beautiful lengths to describe the ways in which Maori youth historically had inhabited what they called political blackness, and hip hop culture and Black liberation politics. Even though they themselves were not Black, they saw themselves as being in like hand in hand solidarity with the Black Panthers, and even started organizations similar to the Panthers, but in the Oceania region. So there's a lot of nuance, and none of it can be answered in the abstract. I think we have to kind of think about what people who are part of those communities are doing, and follow their lead. And I would say, and in following their lead, we have to follow their lead regardless of the consequences of following that lead. And that's where I think, if the consequence of following people's lead is indeed, no, we don't want you to use that term, and I'm not saying anybody says that, but if that is the outcome, then it means, just if we have to damage Portuguese or damage Spanish or damage French or something like that by not being able to describe a cliffside very beautifully, then I think that's like the least we can expect from language and culture that has done so much grievous harm to people for no other reason than wanting to commodify them. So to some extent, like, we have to think about how destructive colonialism and racism has been over 500 years. And when we, so this is not criticizing your question. It's more just elaborating on the fact that there are gentle forms of violence, such as, not being able to use a word in the way that it might have originally been intended. And then there's really direct human violence, such as the experience of slavery and the intergenerational trauma that comes from it. Did I have anything else? I think that was all I needed to say on that. So back to you, Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I mean, great points. And I think, AJ, what I really enjoyed about your response there was drawing attention to the fact that, these things are often treated as equivalents, right? Like, yeah, oh, look, we're doing away with this beautiful, word or cultural tradition, whatever, like these debates over it's the Dutch tradition of children up in blackface, right? And accompanying Santa Claus, this whole thing about anyway, I can't remember the character's name, but it's
What's a Pete?
Oh, that's it, right?
What's a Pete?
And so, like, that's a perfect example, right? You could argue that that's a beautiful Dutch cultural tradition, and that canceling it is offensive. But what is the context it comes out of, right? Where are its roots, and what is it participating in? So yeah, let's not treat those things as equivalents. Anyway, on to the next question. Okay, if Canada is a white supremacist country, then does that automatically make me a white supremacist? If so, then how do you make the distinction between an average Canadian white supremacist like myself and other white supremacist groups? It just seems that nowadays anybody who is not a radical leftist is often labeled Nazi. But to cast such a wide net does not. But to cast such a wide net, does that not water down the term Nazi or racist? Is it safe to label Justin Trudeau as a white supremacist given his blackface, brownface controversies and track record in Indigenous affairs, along with the fact that he is the leader of a white supremacist country? The bar appears to be so low with these labels. How can he not be considered the grand wizard? I'm being facetious, but can you guys acknowledge the hypocrisy here? So this is a good question. It's a good provocative question for sure. And I would say no, I'm not going to be. I was going to be sarcastic, but I don't want to be sarcastic. I'm going to be real about this. No, I don't think it necessarily makes you a white supremacist. I think this is part of what the public discourse around racism in supposedly post-racial societies like Canada has done to these difficult conversations about how racism, like any other social phenomenon, changes shape with the historical context. So, you know, what we're trying to do in using this terminology is to draw attention to the fact that there are deep structural, institutional, and relational roots that shape the social experience and the governing institutions of the country that is called Canada, both domestically and on an international stage, that are deeply and profoundly white supremacist. And if you've been with us over the last, however many episodes we've done, we've talked about tons of examples. We talked about the way that immigration laws, for example, for the longest time favored immigration from Western Europe and discriminated actively and up till the 1970s explicitly in racial terms against brown people, Asian people, all sorts of other folks, right? You Chinese person, your ancestors died building the railway and you had to pay a head tax just to come into the country and bring your family here. That was something never levied against white people, right? We've talked about the ways that obviously indigenous people were denied their own autonomy, dispossessed of territory, treated as wards of the state, as up to the 1960s, 70s. Indigenous women didn't even have the right to vote in Canada in many places. So these kinds of things are what we're talking about when we talk about white supremacy. We're not talking about your hurt feelings. We're not talking about like people being mean to each other. I'm not even actually, when I use that term, speaking about individual racists. What we're doing is we're pointing to it like a social structure. So, like, to take another example, we live in a patriarchal society, right, where men hold power over women and children, right? So as a man, as a cisgendered man in this society, I can benefit from patriarchy without being a patriarch. So I'd like to think, and you could ask my partner, her honest opinion about whether I'm a patriarch or not. But I think like I do my best in my daily life to renounce that role, right? So I don't occupy that space. I don't exercise power over my partner's life. I don't demand, like she take care of the house while I don't have to do any of that. I don't demand she raise the kids and all these kinds of things, right? But in society, I still benefit from patriarchy because I'm a man, right? I don't worry about the state policing my reproductive function in a way that women's are constantly, whether or not, however you feel about abortion, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, be pro, you don't want an abortion, you'd never have one, fine. You can still acknowledge that we live in a society where men's reproductive function is not subject to surveillance and control in the same way that women's are. That's all we're like, it's not even controversial. This is why the culture warriors on the right drive me crazy, because it's like, all right, you want to live one way, that's fine. You go ahead and live that way consensually with somebody else. But what we're talking about is not your choice with your partner to live in that way. We are talking about how society as a whole is organized. And in that sense, yeah, like, I get your question, but what your question begs is a history lesson, right? Like, so were white people ever told that they couldn't leave their community without asking for a pass from racialized people? No. Well, that's why Canada's white supremacist. Did Canada's immigration system, and continues to this day through its point system, discriminate against people migrating here from the parts of the world that the ruling class of this country has, shat upon and eaten up? Yeah, well, that makes it white supremacist. Does Canada participate constantly in wars of occupation that remove problematic leadership, like they did in Haiti in 2004, from a country where Canada's economic interests lie? Yeah, that makes it white supremacist. Those kinds of things, that's what we're talking about. Again, we're not talking about your hurt feelings. We're not talking about like people who are, activists who are too zealous, and there are lots of activists who are too zealous. And I would agree with the point that these words are misapplied. So to get right down to it, no, I don't think it makes you a white supremacist necessarily. It certainly makes you, though, if you are a white person in a white supremacist society, it means you benefit from white supremacy. And that's a distinction worth making. I'm a man. I like, I'm an ambiguously racialized person. There are points in my life where I'm both like policed and surveilled because of my like not quite whiteness, and other points where I benefit from the ability to pass. And so I too, like alternately benefit and am like policed by white supremacy. I have no problem acknowledging that, and neither should you. Just like being a class, like being a person of my class background, like provides me with resources and opportunities that other people don't have, right? Like I don't have to feel guilty about that as long as I'm trying to do something about the world that makes that possible, I think. To get to your point, I mean, is Justin Trudeau a white supremacist? Maybe. I don't know Trudeau personally. I certainly think some of the things he's done in the past are straight up racist. Like, I don't know how anybody puts on blackface or brownface and thinks that's not a hella racist thing to do, right? Like, I don't know if you need an education about that. And like that's Trudeau's problem. Do I think he's the grand wizard of the KKK? No, but then your hyperbole is not helpful, is it? Right? Like, I get your question, but being hyperbolic about it also just it just inflates the terms of the debate, right? It's like what Tucker Carlson does all the time. He's like, oh well, you think all these things are the same thing. No, I don't. I actually think that there's a much more nuanced analysis of what's going on here. But the hard work of making our society anti-racist is not going to happen by people trying to squirrel out of the of recognizing the structural, relational, institutional ways that those forms of power are reproduced. So that's all I'd say about that. You bang on in many cases. Yeah, I agree. I think like Nazi, fascist, all these terms, as we talked about on this program before, are wildly overused. And I don't. I'm somebody who studies fascism and the far right. When I call somebody a Nazi, is because I know that they're an actual Nazi, like they're an adherent to the National Socialist ideology, they're a proponent of it, and they advocate for it. That makes you different than a member of the KKK. It makes you different than being another kind of organized racist. But in the sense that they are white supremacists, yeah, that ties them together in important ways. So, like, really good question, provocative question, but I'd say also, like, don't ignore the fact that both things can be true, that individual people can be good, that lots of groups can be good, and that society as a whole can still be wildly, like profoundly, disgustingly shaped by these ideologies and practices of power and control that we would be much better off without all of us. Over to you, AJ. You're muted.
2.5 years into this stuff, and you'd think I would know how to mute and unmute. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. Alex was pretty comprehensive in his answer. I'm going to try and offer a slightly different take, but I think we're more or less in agreement here. But I want to start by saying somewhat provocatively that, yes, I think you are a white supremacist if you are a product of a white supremacist society and not actively working against it. But what does that mean to be a white supremacist, right? And this is where I think Alex and I actually agree here, is that there's a huge array of iterations of what white supremacy means. Canada is a white supremacist society because Canada, as a settler colonial state, could not have existed were it not for the forces of structural white supremacy that Alex already talked about, that we've explored elsewhere in this project that we do together, immigration policy, like land theft, you name it. So I won't belabor the point with examples on that one. But in this sense, it's similar to what Ibram X. Kendi says about racism, right? If we're all products of a racist society, you're not just born neutrally into a racist society. I mean, you are born neutrally, and then you are immediately socially constructed and organized into thinking certain things. And those things tend to be complicit with the norms and values of your society, just like any society. That's just how societies operate. So as we're being socialized and indoctrinated into structural white supremacy, it does, in fact, to some extent, make you a white supremacist. And that actually has very little to do with your skin color. The skin color aspect helps affect where your position in a structurally white supremacist society is, but not whether or not society is white supremacist. A lot of people who don't have white skin also culturally recreate structural white supremacy through their day-to-day actions, through the internalization of assumptions and values about other racial groups and themselves as well. And this is part of how the sort of trauma of it all operates. So, I had a couple other points here. yeah, to some extent, it's important to go back to basics and differentiate between agents and structure in terms of trying to explore the differences, right? And I think Alex spoke to this really well. It's not that you're like a leading Klansman. It actually matters if you're an organized white supremacist versus you're just getting by and like doing your thing and harboring your views about like immigrants or even like, and I think it's worth saying, even if you're not actively thinking about anything that is so profoundly racist, you know what I mean, as being anti-immigrant or whatnot, simply thinking that you have access to land in an unproblematic way in a place where all of the land has been stolen through processes of colonization also incorporates this. And it's precisely that normal aspect. And this is what I like about your question. You talk about your normal everyday white Canadian. It's a category of people that we all know them. They're all our friends. They're all like our neighbors, all this other stuff. And you don't have to be a mean person to be the product of a structurally racist society or a white supremacist society. And it's actually in those normal, everyday, day-to-day interactions. That's how society is recreated. Society is not recreated when Nazis march in the street or a freedom convoy, like wraps itself in a flag and that sort of thing. That's not where society is recreated. It's in the kind of mundane, everyday, just churning through, like filling out forms, that sort of thing. Immigration policy, labor laws, land theft, these are all things that I talked about. And I think I'll conclude by addressing the Trudeau question. And it's in part because I think Trudeau's black and brown face escapades, among his many others that we probably don't even know about yet, I think it's a really great example, because I'm not trying to love up Trudeau in any way here, but I think that he is a profoundly normal person, aside from being like rich and popular, which I guess so not most people aren't rich and popular, but I don't know that his wealth sets him apart from normal society in this regard of being a product of a white supremacist society, because you could argue that someone with that privilege should be even more aware of what he shouldn't be doing, like the private school education and this and that, except for the fact that it's probably through that private school education that he would have received and then taught in his time as a high school teacher. That is exactly the kind of application of normal society just running its course, where racist ideas are perpetuated. Because when he painted up in those spaces, he was still a high school teacher. I think he was, or maybe he was a student. I don't know. The details of it are a bit overwhelming. But I do think it's important to remember, though, he's not a Klansman. He's actually just a normal dude. For those of you with shorter memories, I was living in Ottawa through much of the Harper regime. And I remember on the day that there was the change in government in the boring bureaucratic city of Ottawa, people were out in the streets singing songs, hugging one another, literally like ding dong, the witch is dead kind of situation, because they were just so happy that somebody who espoused to be a feminist, who said that they, all the different slogans and sunny ways and this and that, political rhetoric is political rhetoric. And at the end of the day, political leaders don't really matter. It's the societies, they are reflections of society rather than society being a reflection of the values of political leaders. So Trudeau will come and go. And this is part of the issue, right? Is that I've oftentimes found that when right-wing conservative and more openly racist people are in charge, it's easier to mobilize against those people. But when it's putting a pleasant face on it, when it's using terminology, like feminism or what have you, it's a little bit trickier. But at the same time, I think we do have to say that, because of those discursive openings that came about since 2015, it's possible for it to be national news that the prime minister was painted up in brown and blackface. Because I can tell you, for those of you who don't remember what life was like under a conservative federal majority government, that would not have been news. And they probably would have actually just defunded the CBC or something if they had made it news. So there are really, the nuances and the differences matter a whole heck of a lot. And that's not to applaud one party or another. I guess I'm not anybody who knows me even remotely knows that I have a deep, deep, deep contempt and distaste for the Conservative Party of Canada. But that's not because I have any love of any other party. It's just because I lived through 10 years of Conservative government. But we digress. Back to you, Alex, for the next question.
Yeah, such good points, AJ. I guess sorry, you did make me think of one thing I'm going to throw in here too, and just as an add-on to that, is that and this is a drum that I think is worth banging on quite a bit these days. We would be remiss in not reminding ourselves that in the aftermath of World War II, in the shadow of the complete and utter defeat of the Nazis, in this kind of like global repudiation of fascism and its horrors as they were displayed by the liberation of the death and concentration camps, there was no way to be kind of a legitimate fascist on the world stage, right? So that doesn't mean fascists and organized racists went away. In countries like France, for example, they went to work in the so-called French New Right, working out a whole new lexicon, like a new language of how to peddle organized fascism and racism in a way that was less controversial and less open than before, because they knew they were dealing with a new kind of like liberal democratic global order. And that didn't stay in France, right? Those ideas have been exported around the world, most prominently to other parts of Western Europe, but also North America, where racists here have very carefully taken up that language. So you can even talk to, actually, just to come back to your question, like I was just listening to an interview with the guy who is the founder of a white supremacist accelerationist terror group, the Base, right? Everybody's heard of the Base these days. He, living in Russia, doing this interview, he talks about, he's like, hey, we're not white supremacists. We just believe in, the ethic of strength through diversity. And what do they mean by that? They mean the separation of racialized groups, right? A white ethno state. They mean those kinds of things. So they have learned to speak the language of diversity and inclusion, but in a way that actually reverses it and turns it into a weapon against the rest of us, right? So I think, like, in your question, that element is also there, that we need to be clear about that, about how racism, like anything else, changes shape with the context, and that people who are organizing to create the world they want are clever and want to create doubt around what they're doing, especially in mainstream society. So just add that in there too. Anyway, on to the next question. This one's much shorter. Won't international conflict crush the reality of collective liberation? For example, states may never agree to one view of such liberation in our geopolitical world. Good question. My simple answer, absolutely. That, as somebody with deep anti-authoritarian tendencies, I would say that, imagining collective liberation, while, the sort of the furthest horizon of it, within sort of a geopolitical order shaped by our current state order, is kind of nonsensical. I do think, that the ultimate horizon is something else, because states themselves, as we know them, are totally bound up in this process of the last 500 years of imperialism, inter-imperial Western European squabbling over how the rest of the world was going to be divided up into colonies for their enrichment. And that was a process that gave birth to what we understand as modern racism. It's a process that has given birth to the dynamics of rule of one class over the rest of us. It's also deeply capitalist, right? So all those things working together at once. So yeah, I would definitely say, I mean, that doesn't mean you can't have pockets or experiments, right? Initiatives that are aiming towards collective liberation in the here and now, that don't need to topple states in order to exist. So one example that's a very popular one in anarchist circles is the Rojava Revolution, right? In Kurdistan. And as Syria descended into civil war, the The Kurdish rebels carved out an autonomous space within what is Syria in Kurdistan, and created their own forms of government and social development and armed forces and all these kinds of things, or the Zapatistas in southern Mexico, which is a favorite example, or indeed lots of indigenous initiatives further north as well, right? I mean, whether we're looking at struggles for the recovery of autonomy and sovereignty amongst First Nations in so-called Canada, or warrior societies or whatever, or whether we're looking at, anarchist crusty punk initiatives, dumpster diving, providing food for folks on the street without paying for it, community libraries, tool libraries, skill shares, anarchist book fairs, a million different examples, right? All little examples of attempts at achieving some kind of escape velocity from the gravitational pull of exploitation and oppression as it's constituted. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's in the vested interests of the ruling class of our current world order to destroy those experiments, right? Just like we've talked about before, the destruction of maroon communities in the context of the colonization of North America, not because they were like military powers threatening to topple Britain and France or Portugal or Spain or whatever, but because they couldn't be allowed to stand as examples of alternatives. I mean, think back to, the rousting of the Occupy encampments. What was that about, right? It wasn't just about clearing public space and all this nonsense about, public health issues, right? It was about not allowing an example of alternative social order to exist in the midst of the one that currently dominates. So yeah, this is the struggle against up which we will run ultimately. And the Spanish Civil War is a great example, right? Where, Franco's regime receives money and weapons from all kinds of other countries because they're not because they necessarily love fascists exactly, but they're more willing, the liberal democratic order is more willing to tolerate fascists than it is to tolerate anarchists, And again, the example of Zapatistas, the infamous Chase Manhattan Bank memo issued in the wake of the Zapatista uprising, where Chase Manhattan Bank, right, one of the biggest financial institutions on a global scale, says to the Mexican government, you need to eliminate the Zapatistas to demonstrate your control over your own territory. Otherwise, investors are going to run. Those kinds of things are very powerful incentives, right? And mark the struggle that we're involved in for sure. So I just tend to be a little less dogmatic about it than I think than answering this one way or another. Yes, you're right. The current order can't accept that. But then look at the stress the current order is under, right? Climate wise, pandemic wise, resource wise, 1,000 different different vectors of tension hitting it all at once, right? So I think, we really need to think about that. We need to think about not just whether that dominant order will tolerate us and our experiments, but how and where our experiments are most effective and can flourish the best, and where they're the greatest threat to that order too. And I would actually say that those powers that be are quite afraid of those experiments, and that we should take heart from the fear that they provoke, right? And take heart from the fact that they see us as a threat, even though rhetorically they often don't. But yeah, definitely learning how to protect those experiments, nurture them, defend them. That's a huge issue for sure. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I was thinking, obviously, I mean, I feel like, and maybe this isn't true, the person who asked this question, international conflict, you're probably at the moment thinking about the international conflicts that are happening right now. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that it's kind of on everybody's mind. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about Russia and the Ukraine. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about conflict in general, things happening in Yemen, things happening in Ethiopia, things happening all over the world. And I think this kind of gets to my point in terms of answering your question, is that peace doesn't bring about collective liberation either. So if peace can't bring about collective liberation, we shouldn't necessarily assume that international conflict is going to weigh decisively on whether or not collective liberation is going to happen. Collective liberation won't ever come from states or organizations like states, precisely because they have so much to gain from conflict. And, just to offer one historical example of this, think about many of you who've gone through high school history, you might have learned about the 100 Years of Peace, the idea that we had this amazing period of international peace from about 1814 to about 1914 with the start of World War I. The point that I would make about that, which is something that I go to a lot in my teaching and writing on this, is that 100 years of peace was 100 years of peace for powerful European countries. It was the externalization of war, conflict, misery, and murder onto the vast majority of this planet. Go and talk to people in the Congo about what the 19th century experience was like for them. Talk to the indentured laborers, talk to the enslaved Africans who were still, because we're not just talking about the British Empire. Yeah, the British Empire might have ended slavery in 1833, 34. It went on a whole lot longer in America, in the United States anyway, and elsewhere. This period, our perceptions of peace are textured by who has power in the international system. And even when we talk about in more contemporary terms, like peace, generally peace has meant throughout the Cold War that one or the other of the two Cold War powers had successfully taken over or dominated the politics of another smaller country, many of whom were building incredible alternatives, even at the level of state. And I always think about Grenada, I always think about Burkina Faso. And if you don't know about the kind of national histories of these places, it's really worth looking up because these were countries led by people who were really motivated and dedicated to creating alternatives. Cuba is a common example. Alex already mentioned the Zapatistas in southern Mexico. There have been endless amounts of really compelling alternatives that have a deep commitment and investment and practical application of liberation. Obviously, all of them with their faults. We can't expect any kind of purity, in these projects, but the conflict has been essential to it. And I think we need to kind of remember some of what we learned from reading anti-colonial theorists, people like Frantz Fanon, for example, who understands that there is not just a therapeutic element to violence at times, but there's also an inherently revolutionary period that comes through conflict. Conflict is generative. And I know that sounds weird in our context where we're seeing such like a completely unnecessary war happening in Europe. But I would remind you that it's also happening all over the world too, in different forms. It's just that our media scape, the implications of structural white supremacy at a global level lead us to focus entirely on what's happening in the Ukraine. And this is not because we should absolutely be focusing on what's happening in the Ukraine. It's terrible. I don't want anybody to misunderstand my meaning, but we should be as interested in Afghanistan or Yemen or Somalia and Ethiopia and all the other places in the world that are suffering under completely avoidable warfare right now that is playing out because of the hubris of stronger powers and empire. Empire never stopped, it transformed, and all of these things are happening at the same time. So conflict, the reason why I don't want to let go of the idea of conflict as a potentially generative force is simply because of history. We've seen that it has generated alternatives. And what it does is it forces us all of us who might have been lulled into a relative complacency of thinking that, we just need to pressure the government to do this, or we just need to, wait and something's going to sort itself out in the courts or something like that. It reminds us that actually most people don't have the time or luxury to wait for people to just come around to their senses and be like, actually, I don't like oppressing other people. It's the conflict that helps cause that. The Black Panthers understood this, Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis understood the value of conflict as a generative thing. So not all conflict is war, so international imperial conflict, that's a bad thing. Conflict motivated by nationalist aspirations. And even Fanon said, Fanon, if you go back and you read your Fanon talks about how it's not even enough to win the Revolutionary War. if you win a revolutionary war and then try to stay comfortable in your role as the sort of post-colonial revolutionary elite, then you yourself become precisely the enemy against which the artists and the revolutionaries and all the others need to fight. So just like how movements are always going, conflict in a general sense is always necessary in order for good things to come up. Just like agitating soil, to allow something to grow. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for that, AJ. I mean, this is what Marx argues, right? Fundamentally, is that history is a movement of opposing forces, right? And that the new history is born from the clash of those forces. And that doesn't always have to be violence, as AJ is saying, right? But sometimes it has to be. If there's a force that won't let you live your life with dignity or be recognized as fully human, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to beg that force for recognition. I mean, this is part of this kind of nonsense idea, this liberal idea of how abolition or women's rights was won. It's like, oh, and they just, begged and pleaded and wrote really famous treaties that white men read and were moved by, and then liberation happened, right? Speaking about the white supremacist legacy of Canada, let's not forget that there were conservative politicians here who tried to get Nelson Mandela labeled a terrorist because he was in prison for engaging in an armed struggle against his white supremacist terrorizers, right? This is how people think, and I mean, if you've been watching us on the series, we've had these kinds of questions about the revolution in Haiti as well. Like, oh my goodness, isn't it awful that white people and people of mixed background were killed by Black revolutionaries? I mean, I'm not trying to celebrate atrocity, okay? But honestly, on the scale of what we confront on a daily basis, as AJ's just illuminated, we have to be clear about this, and we have to be clear about, where the real violence is coming from. Anyway, on to our next question. I think we have time for a couple more before we wrap up. This one is quite concise too. Should I use the term BIPOC? Seems like it's contested. So for those of you who don't know, of course, very common term, but Black, indigenous, people of color. This is the term that, is used frequently by, lots of people, activists, perhaps especially, to refer sort of, to a large group of racialized and oppressed people. I think, it's a question of terminology, and I guess it depends what you're referring to. I don't love the term myself. I don't use it that much. I think it does, for me, it's not really a problematic term exactly. It's kind of just, for me, it just lumps too much together. It's like those experiences of Black, indigenous, and other racialized people, they're different. They sometimes come into conflict. They have been used, those histories overlap, but are not the same. Settler colonialism is a different process than racialized oppression or exploitation. I'm not saying one is worse or better. That's not what we're talking about. They're just different. And for me, I think it's kind of a good faith attempt, like so many of our acronyms, to lump together diverse struggles and make sense of them. And I think, give voice to them. But if we use them too often, I think we do become maybe a little bit uncritical, of what they're referring to, and imagine that those groups are cohesive and in ways that they're not. I mean, even internally, obviously, as AJ's already talked about, right? Like, just because you have dark skin doesn't mean you can't be a white supremacist. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you can't be an advocate of patriarchy. There are lots of those people, unfortunately, around. Just because you're a poor person doesn't mean you can't vote for people like Donald Trump or Stephen Harper and believe somehow magically that their ruling class interests are going to trickle down to you. So we have lots of examples of that kind of internal division within communities, right? Just because you're a racialized person does not make you a saint by any means. And so I think that's my hesitation there. So I would say, I'm not telling you not to use it, for sure. It's common. It is used. It's not my term of choice. I tend to like to be specific as possible about the thing that I'm talking about and try not to make too many of those big generalizations. But I think if you're talking about the tension, especially in settler colonial societies, between, sort of the white settler population and other folks, then BIPOC probably makes a lot of sense still, because it is one of the major dividing lines, especially in white supremacist societies. But I say use it with care. try to know your histories, try to understand the differences, and when you do use it, sort of in a qualified way, I guess. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Acronyms of any kind, I generally hate acronyms. I never heard of the term BIPOC until I became a professor, and then my students taught me about it. And I saw that they were using it, and I just followed along. I was like, okay, I see what you're trying to get at here. Like Alex said, the problem is that it homogenizes. But when you look at what all of the different identities have in common, it's structural white supremacy. And it's not the same experience under structural white supremacy, and that's part of the problem. So like Alex, I try and focus on naming the source of the problem, and the source of the problem is structural white supremacy, and then the particularities can come out after. You would be alarmed, well, maybe not alarmed if you're here in this space, but you would be shocked anyway, at least, to see the kind of reaction it has on people's faces when you start naming whiteness and naming structural white supremacy. In the kind of sister project to this project that I'm involved with, the White Fragility Clinic, that's in some ways just been the primary learning objective of White Fragility Clinic, has been normalizing the use of white in the same way that we might talk about black or indigenous. Indigenous itself is, I think, an equally contested term because it homogenizes across nations. Whenever possible, we should always strive for the greatest level of specificity because, like a Mi'kmaq worldview and a perspective on water and the governance of water is going to be different from a Cree one, in part because there's no oceans, in the middle of the country. There's a lot of oceans here, so place-based specificity is always better. But to defend it to some extent, the BIPOC, because again, I'm fairly ambiguous about it. One of the things that I think is useful about terms of any kind is to see how it generates its own meaning over time and use. So, I'd never heard of it when I became a professor in 2016. And then I saw the kinds of student activism that was organizing around it. It appeared to create a vocabulary for non-white students in particular to organize space together, to have conversations with one another that I remember never having when I was a young person, an undergrad. I never had an opportunity to meet with people who identified as Black and Indigenous and queer, and it just wasn't part of my university experience. And I wish it were, because it's been very generative. We have a group on campus here called BIPOC, which is a really awesome group of very young people who saw value in this title, and they get together and they have conversations. They intervene in the direction of the university's policy. They've had impact on shaping these kinds of things. So my sense is to kind of follow it. And I'm always reminded of the term, maybe some of you have heard of the term BRICS. It became really popular about 20 years ago in kind of international studies. It just stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Sometimes it's BRICS, sometimes it's BRICS. It had nothing to do with those countries. It was some white economist came up with the term because he was talking about an economic phenomena that actually had nothing necessarily to do with one another. And then Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa looked at one another and was like, we can roll with that. Let's do something. And then they formed an international organization and they do a bunch of stuff. So, follow it through. Sometimes it's generative. Try not to look for a constant essential meaning out of any of these terms. They're all basically placeholders for the broader experience of life under structural white supremacy. Back to you, Alex.
All right, I think we're just about ready to wrap up, but we're gonna shoehorn in one more question here, I think, and then I will toss it over to AJ for his answer and for the wrap up. So here we go. Hi, first and foremost, thank you for doing this Q&A. I don't think I've ever been so grateful for the opportunity to ask questions without shame, not too much anyways. Speaking of shame though, how do you feel about Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility? Is it theoretically sound? Does it have a solid evidence base? But mostly, do her concepts hinder or accelerate social justice? I suppose I ask this question not because I don't believe in white fragility, but because I'm not entirely bought on the things she says to do about it. Thank you. Well, thank you for your question, and thank you very much for the kind words about our little initiative here. It's what we've been trying to do. So just quickly from my perspective, I do think DiAngelo's work is valuable. I think it's particularly valuable for white identified people who are coming to understand racial injustice. I think, for me, and reading that book, it's it's hard for me to dig down too critically because so much of it, I think, if you have been working or thinking and reading in the area, it's, there's nothing really new there, right? In the sense that other scholars, other practitioners, activists, people who have struggled against this stuff have been talking about these same concepts. But she presents it in accessible and in an accessible way to non-specialists. I think that's super valuable. Um, I think my big criticism, I'm not going to make too much out of this because I think there's been a lot of hay made over this in our social mediated environment, is, the translation of this stuff into very lucrative consultancies and these kinds of things for, once again, a kind of like, what Robin DiAngelo is a white person, she's a part of this kind of like consultative class. I'm not going to bash her for that. I mean, people do, right? I think it's a little hypocritical, to be honest. Like, is it fair that she's making pretty good money off of this? Probably not, but capitalism isn't fair, right? So I feel like, nitpicking on her is like shooting fish in a barrel on this one. Yeah, I think the concepts are valuable. No, I don't think any. I mean, your question is hard. It's a good question. Do I think it advances social justice? Basically, yeah, sure. I mean, if it gets people to think about, as AJ, has talked about, like the difficulty in bringing white identified people to talk about whiteness is a really hard thing. And if you've had conversations, if you're a white person, you got a white family, or if you got white people in your life and you've tried to do this, I mean, you probably have examples yourself, right? Like dinner table conversations that go like totally sideways because white identified people get super tied up in knots because like it's like you're calling them, yeah, like the grand wizard of the KKK by talking about how we could unpack whiteness. And I think DiAngelo's work is most valuable there. Like in terms of charting a sort of a more revolutionary course, no, but I don't think she would say she's doing that anyway. So you want a revolutionary course, you got to read people like Fanon, right? Like read Black Skin, White Masks, read Wretched of the Earth. It's like an incredible perspective from the perspective of the colonized, about what those racial hierarchies do to people's souls and identities and political struggles and all of that stuff. But if you're a white person or have white people in your life and you're struggling to come to terms with this, I mean, my real, like, honest advice is to wait for frequently asked white questions in fall 2022 and buy that book instead. So on that shameless plug, I'm going to throw it over to AJ.
Thanks, Alex. I don't even know what to add after that. That's an ideal ending, but I will say a couple other things. In part, especially if Robin DiAngelo is watching, we do like your book. We hope you like our book. But to be honest, like there's not a whole lot to the substance of your question. There's not a whole lot new theoretically, or even in I think there's more empirically in it than there is theoretically. It's kind of a clinical book in that regard, right? And those of you who haven't necessarily read it yet, you'll get an awful lot of it just if you just read the 2011 article that precedes it under the same name, White Fragility, and it's open access, so you can download it for free and read it. The real question is it useful? Because to be honest with you, the overwhelming majority of books that are published don't say anything particularly brand new. Writing a book is more about, like, can you take an interesting spin on it that helps people to think differently about something? DiAngelo never purported to be writing for or about people of color. She's pretty clear about that. And I do have to say, I've been doing a lot of work with white people in particular in the last 4 or 5 years. And her ability to reach people who look like her is really, really good and strong. And on the one hand, yeah, it's annoying because there's at least 100 years of like quality scholarship and analysis from people of color, like We could start even in the early 20th century with W.E.B. Du Bois and his development of the color line. But, Eric Williams and C.L.R. James have explained what this looked like in terms of politics and history. We've seen Walter Rodney apply it to the field of development studies, but also with his groundbreaking book, Europe and the Europe and the Underdevelopment of Africa. But also in his kind of very positive book on Groundings with My Brothers, where he works with Rastafari communities in Jamaica and understands how people who in many ways have been crushed by the expectations of society still manage to live really good lives that have better health indicators and outcomes than so-called mainstream developed society. So, and there's no end to that, right? Like Carol Anderson, more generally in the United States, describes it using the terminology of white rage. But I think that we should be mindful of the fact that when scholars of color or activists or writers of color, when they make these arguments, the white structures, white publishing, white cultural analysis, white academia doesn't want to work with it and this is where you hear things like, oh, somebody's playing a race card, and we've said many times on the show before, nobody's playing cards when we're talking about race. It's not a game. It's our lived experience. And for whatever reason, white people really latch on to people like Robin DiAngelo. And for my part, I'm like, okay, that's a great entry point, but understand that it's an entry point in the same way that if you're learning how to swim, you're gonna, like, a program like ours is about learning how to swim. It's not about understanding, mastering any kind of concepts of like critical race theory or anti-racism. You have to go out and do stuff to do that. And I think it's the same with DiAngelo. DiAngelo offers a very accessible way in. We hope that frequently asked white questions, is going to offer a similar kind of entry point. And the more people who have that entry point, our belief in a very simplistic way is that once you have a good entry point, once you start feeling secure about asking really good questions, you're going to go out and find answers to your own questions through your actions. So we really hope, by way of conclusion, we really hope that you have good, restful summers. We really hope that you'll pick up a copy of our book, that you'll read it, that you'll talk about it, that you'll hate it, that you'll give it to people who are going to hate it, and that you'll give it to people who are going to love it. And that we'll be able to keep having conversations like this at a much broader scale. So thank you, everyone who's been here throughout the entirety of our season 2. We will be back with season 3 in the fall. We will be armed with FAQ, frequently asked white questions. Thank you to Fernwood for your steadfast support for this project. None of this would have happened without your support. So with that, drum roll, please. Here is the cover of Frequently Asked White Questions.